Hi, today I'd like to talk about narcissism and depression. Not your typical narcissistic personality, but rather somebody who's perfectly normal, but then they develop a narcissistic tendency after they become depressed, and why this could be a potential warning signal if it's somebody who you care about. Narcissism, we all know about, is usually something not very appealing. We all know narcissistic people and how they maybe drive us mad. But there's also a form of narcissism which can develop in very ordinary, normal people who are not in the least bit narcissistic. And this is the narcissism I want to talk to you about today and why it's a potential hazard and what potentially we can do about it. Now, first of all, we have to understand narcissism itself. Narcissism, we tend to think of somebody who's narcissistic as being a kind of big head and egotistical person, but it's not quite as simple as you think. By and large, the majority of people who are narcissistic are actually victims to circumstance. The human personality develops in the first 7 or 8 years of life, and we have a thing called the subconscious mind, which orders and organizes how the mind processes things. So if a person's having a hard time as a child, whereby they don't receive much validation, usually from their parents, often the personality will develop in a way that it boosts themselves. They start thinking that they're great at everything. So in actuality, they have an inferiority complex, but then they develop a superiority complex. Anybody who feels superior always feels inferior. If you're genuinely feeling superior, let's say feeling great about everything, you wouldn't feel superior at all. You'd feel just normal. Okay. So most narcissistic people are actually, their personality developed in a way of coping with this situation. Of course, we have a small minority of narcissistic people who are simply the victims of bad parenting, or maybe they were very beautiful or very rich or very famous or a very high status individual, and the parents never checked it. The parents never gave them any sense of normalcy or responsibility, and as a result, they just believe all the sort of people are saying how great they are all the time. They bought into it. But by and large, most narcissistic people are actually victims. When we look at narcissistic people, we can also see that there's a low functioning and a high functioning, not self-aware and a self-aware. The low functioning narcissistic personality is the sort of person, if you say I ran 100 meters in 10.5 seconds in college, they'll tell you they ran it in 9.5 seconds. Matter of fact, they'll tell you they probably won the world record, but nobody was there to see it. If you told them you ran 2 marathons, they'll tell you they did 10 or 15 marathons. If you told them that you earned $100,000 last year, they'll tell you they made $1 million, even though they have a worn out car and they live in a 1-bedroom apartment. So these sort of low functioning narcissistic people usually don't achieve anything in life because they're so self-enwrapped and ignorant and unaware. They just drift around in a dream and irritate people. But we also have high-functioning narcissists. So there's a trope of narcissism of just people who are a waste of space, but there's plenty of high-functioning. Probably the easiest example, say from fiction, would be Tony Stark in the Iron Man and Marvel movies and comics, whereby he's super successful, he is a genius, but he knows it too much. He's high-functioning, but he's very narcissistic. He likes talking about himself. He thinks he's great. That's a very key thing with narcissistic people. A person with a narcissistic personality believes that they are right. We also have self-aware and unself-aware. If we look at, say, President Donald Trump, for example, he would appear to be a narcissist. Now, I don't know for sure if he is a narcissist, but he goes on about how great he is, and he seems to be not very aware. So he would appear to be a high-functioning but low self-aware narcissist. Now, this might not be the case. I do know he's a businessman. I do know he likes to appeal to an audience. And he's quite happy to irritate some people as long as he has a base that thinks he's great. Also, the media doesn't like him, which also adds to the muddle. So we don't really know what the real Donald Trump is like. We only know what he projects. And so I don't know for sure. But he projects himself as somebody who's narcissistic and maybe not very aware of it. If we go back to Tony Stark in the fictional world, he is aware. He makes fun of it. He says, "Oh, I'm being a narcissist again." This is a very important thing with any personality type. If, say, you're a very angry person, or you're a very sad person, or you're an extrovert, an introvert, you can't change these things. By 8 years of age, 95% of who you are is there, by 8 years of age. So you can't change the essential who you are. You can change a lot, but not the essential self. But you can make fun of it. You can put it back in its box. And that's what Tony Stark does in those Iron Man movies. He makes fun of it because the narcissist honestly believes he's better at everybody else. He can even look, or she can look at the results and say, I know I'm not better than everybody else, but I feel I'm better than everybody else. So that's a mature narcissist, okay? And that's how you work around your personality type. You make fun of the fact that you're an extrovert. You make fun of the fact that you're an introvert, or so on. So that's basically, and we have a trope, of course, of narcissism, the person self-enwrapped, a very big ego and so on. And yeah, there are narcissists like that, but I also just want to clarify there's lots of narcissists who are nice people who are not self-enwrapped in themselves. I mean, they are self-enwrapped, but they're very likable. As long as you're happy with the fact that their life is based upon themselves. They keep talking about themselves. They keep saying how great they are. But many of them can still be loving, nice people, successful people, happy people, helpful people. But you just have to accept that they're going to talk about themselves and think very highly of themselves. So that's your traditional narcissist. But what about the person who is a normal person and becomes narcissistic when depressed? Well, this is a very worrying sign, because what happens with depression is that basically we have a thing called the inner critic, and the inner critic is basically your conscience, and it develops during childhood. When a parental figure or an elder says, don't do this or don't do that, this critical faculty develops. And so we learn that when the other child has a pen that we like, we don't just grab the pen. We realize that we shouldn't do that. When our elders say, share your bag of chips or your Coke or something, we learn to share. And so it develops that sort of doing the right thing. But it is arbitrary. So you could get a guilt complex over things which you shouldn't be guilty of. I mean, for example, I was raised a Roman Catholic. We're kind of raised to feel guilty about everything. And it's there, but it's not objectively true. It's just something we were taught. So our conscience, by and large, is arbitrary. Our inner critic criticizes for things which basically were criticized by people we're surrounded by as kids. So, for example, if a person's homosexual, but in their family that's not accepted, well, they might have a hard job. Initially, they'll feel guilty about being a homosexual because they will criticize themselves and take them time to get out of that, for example. Okay. So the inner critic has its uses, gives us conscience, but it is arbitrary and it tends to pick on us a lot. And when it goes out of control for a wide variety of reasons, we get depressed. So actually, when we're in depression, the inner critic is actually giving us a hard time. Okay. Now, if you talk to doctors and so on, psychiatrists, they might give you a different picture. The picture, they might talk about chemical imbalance of the brain, but it's the chicken and the egg. Is it the chemical imbalance that causes depression, or is it the depression that causes the chemical imbalance, or is it a bit of both? Are some people maybe genetically predisposed to depression and other people are not? It's a complex subject. But from my experience, I would say practically what I'd see is that people are depressed. It's like an internal uncomfortable situation, but with judgmentalism thrown in there. That would be my experience of depression. So what happens with the person who's depressed is their inner critic is giving them a hard time. They might be consciously aware of it, they might not be consciously aware of it. So whether it's at a conscious level or subconscious level, the inner critic is doing its thing. Now, what happens with the narcissism thing is that when a person's depressed, they become kind of, instead of being outgoing, they become ingoing. Now, a person can be an introvert, a person can be an extrovert. The extrovert person likes interacting a lot with people externally. The introvert usually is more like stay-at-home type, do their own thing. But they can both function externally when they have to. When we see people getting depressed, whether they're introverted or extroverted, they tend to turn more within. They find it hard to find succor from outside. They get more self-absorbed and so on and so forth. So what we have to do with depression is we have to own up to it. We have to see what it is. We have to work at it. We have to talk to different people. We might have to go to our doctor or a counselor, get some counseling, maybe get some antidepressants for a while. We have to work through our depression. Now, if a person is depressed and they become very narcissistic, that they're becoming more and more self-absorbed, it means they're going more and more inward and they're getting stuck in this kind of mental loop. Because the whole thing with depression is a kind of mental loop. I hope I don't get depressed again. Oh, here it comes, the depression. And you're kind of self-absorbed to some degree with depression. But if you become excessively self-absorbed in depression, then it means that you're becoming narcissistically depressed. And the problem with that is, by and large, when people become more and more self-absorbed, the more self-absorbed you are, the less self-reflective you are. Self-reflectivity is a sign of maturity. Becoming self-absorbed is a sign of immaturity. And what happens in people who are becoming, okay, let's say this person is getting treatment for depression, but they're becoming more and more narcissistic. Well, then the treatment's not working. Do you need to have a chat with their counselor, or change counselor, or change drugs, or people need to talk to them? They are going more in rather than out of depression. But for a lot of people who are becoming narcissistically depressed, what's actually happening is that they're not getting treatment, and they won't take treatment, and they're not interested. And there's sort of people who talk to them for an hour and a half, give great advice, they seem to agree with everything you say, and then they ignore it completely. That's what they usually tend to do. They become more distant, more difficult to deal with, more erratic. And it's a real sign that they need help. Also, in some cases, not all cases, but some cases, you'll see people becoming very self-enwrapped. And a very normal person maybe last year, but now very self-enwrapped. And they start doing erratic things. Like they'll crash their car, just walk away from the car. They forget that they even crashed the car. They see somebody attractive, and they just, even though that person's married, kids, everything, they just walk up and start chatting to them in front of the other person, as if they don't matter, because it only matters, I want you. Why don't you want me? And they start doing just this odd, weird behavior, and you start thinking, what's with this person? In that case, it can often be a risk factor for suicide. Now, I don't want to get carried away with the suicide thing. There's many factors. There seems to be even genetic factors, behavioral factors. There are certain people, we always think that a person is suicidal is building up over time, but there's many people who have no depression, no negative thoughts, everything's fine. Next thing, they try and kill themselves. And then later when people ask why you did it, I don't know, it just came over me. So there seems to be some kind of mental trigger. There seems to be people with a disposition. And of course, the traditional thing is somebody getting more and more depressed and more down, and everybody can see where they're heading to. But there's a wide variety of possibilities that can create depression. But one sign, I've seen it before on several occasions, where the person gets more and more and more erratic, more self-absorbed, and more narcissistic. And often it's a warning. And, usually when somebody commits suicide, everybody's like shocked. Oh my God, I didn't think they're going to commit suicide. Because usually most people don't say, I'm thinking I'm going to. They just don't do anything. They just become odder and odder and weirder, and then they kill themselves. And everybody else that says, oh, I should have known. They came around the house and they kept talking about what we did like 10 years ago and how great it was. And there's something odd about them. They're in a very strange space. So I don't have to worry too much if somebody you care about is like that, but I'm saying it's a worrying sign. So what to do about it? Because remember, the actual normal narcissistic person is a personality type, just like somebody is an angry type, somebody is an extrovert, somebody is a quiet type, somebody is an artistic type. It's a personality type. You don't suddenly develop at 20 or 30 or 40 years of age. So what you have to do in this situation is some kind of intervention. You have to try and talk to them, see if that gets somewhere. If that doesn't work, have some kind of intervention, family, friends, get together. Hey, we all know you're acting a bit odd. What's happening here? And if that doesn't work, you might have to get doctors involved. The worst case scenario, of course, is a full medical intervention where the police are called as well. And they arrest somebody and bring them in for medical, psychological overview to see how they are. And they literally won't let the person out until they feel that the person is not a hazard to themselves or others. And that could mean they could be there for a day, a week, a month, a year, however long it is before they feel it's safe to let them go. So people don't like hearing about this one, of course. And in fiction, it's always the innocent person's dragged off to the mental asylum. And that does happen sometimes. There are some like wealthy people and so on, and their family tries to get rid of them. It does happen. And also the doctors are always portrayed to be evil monsters. But by and large, in reality, this is a last case scenario. Families that usually try and get a kind of this intervention whereby the police come around and so on. They talk to their doctor, and the doctors explain the situation, that they're a hazard to themselves, a hazard to other people. It is rare, and usually the patient, the person who is basically effectively arrested and taken away for psychological evaluation, they're usually not happy about it, because they're usually convinced that they're fine. Everybody else is saying, like last night you were naked out in the garden and shouting and screaming, and they think they're normal, and everybody else thinks they're a bit nuts. But it is necessary sometimes. If the person is potentially going to kill themselves or potentially going to hurt somebody else, this has to happen. Now, this is unlikely, rarely happens. Worst case scenario, Nobody's getting through to them. They're acting very odd. They are a danger to themselves or others. I'm just kind of showing. So the key thing really is that just be aware that if somebody you care about becomes depressed and gets more and more narcissistic, you don't just become narcissistic, all right? They're going in the wrong direction. It is a warning sign they're going in the wrong direction, and you need to talk to somebody about it and see what you're going to do about it. Because that person needs help and they don't know they need help. And many times, more and often than not, they'll pull out of it. And sometimes as well, people go to what we could call the dark night or so. They go through spiritual experience. They kind of, a fuse blows in their head. They get a bit mad for a while, a bit narcissistic for a while. And then they come through and they have a kind of life-transforming experience. So sometimes it can be good. But in general, it's a warning sign. I just want to put it out there today because I think it's something to be aware of. That narcissism and depression can be a potential danger. I came across as a question in Quoro. I just thought it was relevant because I've seen it on a few occasions. I don't think most people are aware of it, that it is a warning sign. Usually before people either have a mental breakdown or get very, very depressed or commit suicide, usually they start doing erratic stuff like this. And if you can stop them doing that, in some cases it might save their life. In other cases it might just save them heading into a very severe breakdown or into a severe depression that takes a long time to get out of. So it's just a warning sign. If you know somebody, you care about somebody, it's just something to look at and be aware of, because we should try and catch these things earlier and stop them becoming more serious problems. Okay, so I hope that helps you. That's it for today, and we'll talk to you again next time.